Today's stories do contain subject matter that some viewers may find sensitive, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you want to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And thank you. This happened when I worked at a local fish and seafood restaurant. I was working the evening shift and we had a couple come in, so I greeted them and escorted them to a nearby booth. I asked them for drinks. He got some kind of soda and she got water. I came back with their drinks and took their order. He ordered a full course meal. He got an appetizer, an entree, and even got a side salad and rolls. And when I asked her, she just looked up at me like a deer in the headlights, and he said, "She doesn't want anything." And he quickly moved the conversation back to him, asking about a cake and then ordering said dessert. I walked away kind of confused, but put the order in. I've seen similar instances where one person didn't order anything, or ordered very little, or took most of it home. But I've never seen where someone answers for another person saying they didn't want anything. But I thought, I don't get paid enough to investigate it. And it's probably not that deep anyways, so I moved on. But in those situations that I mentioned, the parties are still talking to each other, or maybe even sneaking stuff off their plate. But these two people were doing nothing of the sort. He was nearly inhaling his food and looking pretty gross about it, chewing with his mouth open, snorting, coughing, making a mess, all of it. And the woman just sat there, sitting straight, hands being held in her lap with her ankles crossed, never taking her eyes off of him, with no conversation to be had. When he finished, he paid, leaving a decent cash tip, and left. I figured that would be the last of the weird situation. But then, they started coming in weekly. He would order stuff and she would never get anything. But she always seemed to look worse and worse. The first time, she was in a nice fitted black dress. It had a shimmer to it, like it was silky, but it also had silver lace along the edges of the sleeves, the bottom hem, and the collar. She was on the thinner side, but it was form-fitting. I think you know what I mean. But every time they came in, he would wear something different. She was always in the same dress. It looked like the dress was falling apart as she wore it. It seemed to get looser on her, like she was losing weight, or like she had it in multiple different sizes. The lace hem on the bottom was unraveling, and the one around her chest was discolored, like something dark was spilled on it. After a while, it just seemed unsettling. Was she not eating at all? Was she being starved? And if so, why? I finally got my chance to ask about it when in the middle of his meal he started choking, and when he was finally done coughing in her face, he threw his napkin down and walked to the restroom. I went over to the table and I asked her if she needed anything. She again just stared at me, but squinted like she was confused. Then all she said was, "Pen." I gave her my pen and she immediately stuck it in her hair that appeared to be pinned up, no longer to be seen, and then looked back down at his plate. He started walking back to the table as I was walking away when I heard a loud, "Hey!" I turned around to see him standing next to her, and he motioned for me to come over. When I approached, he said, "What were you doing?" I told him that I had heard him coughing, which was an understatement, and I wanted to make sure he was okay and ask if they needed anything. He asked me if she had talked to me, and I said no. Then, he sat back down smiling and said, "Good," and continued eating. After he finished eating, he paid and left again. One of the last times that I saw them was a few weeks after that experience. She was not looking good. The lace on the bottom of her dress was completely gone, and her eyes were dark and sunken in. No amount of makeup that she was wearing could cover that. Again, he went to the restroom. I saw over the wall that she was looking down at the table and then looked back up. He came out and they left. I went to clean the table, and this time there was a napkin folded up in the seat next to her. It had something in a different language written on it. I immediately took it home, not telling anyone what it was, and I started looking it up. It turned out it was Dutch, and it said something like, "This is not the American dream I expected. I will make my own. I will overcome." I didn't really know what to do with this information, so I kept it to myself and decided that I would try asking about it if I got the chance. They came in once more, but this time, the guy seemed irritated. He was short and curt with me, even when placing his order. He was very rushed throughout the whole thing, and if he needed anything else, he would use that deep voice and yell for me by name. At one point, I noticed the girl looked like she was slightly swaying, like a sickly sway. So my manager actually came over because of his yelling, warning him that if he didn't stop, he would be kicked out. Then he noticed the girl and leaned down, putting his hand on her shoulder, and he asked if she was okay. The guy immediately got defensive, standing up and yelling, "She's fine. Take your hands off of her." My manager stood up and said, "How about we let her answer?" and tried to get her to talk, but she would just stare. I wasn't over there, so this was all what he told me, but he said that she looked scared. She never said anything, but the guy grabbed her by the arm, and they both left in a rush without paying. And this was enough for my manager to call the cops, since he ate most of his food anyways, and then skipped on the bill. So, we explained to them what had happened, and described the weird situation with the girl. I, admittedly, did leave out the note that I got. I didn't know if it would be relevant, or if maybe she was just venting. I had no idea. And I later regretted that decision. It had been a few weeks since that had taken place, and I was watching the news in the little break room at work. There was a man's body found in his home after police did a welfare check because he had missed work with no calls. They said that he was found with a pen in his throat, so they were investigating it as a homicide. I thought it was weird, but didn't really think much of it, until I saw another article come up as I was scrolling through Facebook on my phone about the same guy that had been killed. This time, it had a picture of the guy, and obviously to my surprise, it was the same one that had come in with that girl. So then I went and read into the story, and sure enough, it was him. He'd been stabbed with a pen. They said they had a person of interest, but they hadn't found her yet. All I could think was, what the hell happened between them? Why did she write what she did in Dutch? Why did she never speak? And why was she seemingly starved? And then, was that my pen that she used? I had a quick fear that my prints could even be on it if so, but then thought, that was weeks prior. Surely it wouldn't be possible, right? I guess that was an accurate assumption too, because I was never contacted, but I did continue following the story. As far as I could tell, they never found or caught the suspect. It's still something that I think about regularly, but I wouldn't even know where to start to try to find this mysterious woman. I have a creepy story that took place on my 20th birthday back in 2017. Back then, I was a bit down on my luck, so on my birthday, my cousin, Sasha, called me and told me that she was going to take me out to eat a nice lunch for my birthday, and I was not going to turn that down. Sasha was my best friend growing up, so I loved spending time with her. And since she and I had grown apart, I was more than happy to go with her. She had offered to take me to a really nice Italian place, but I'm also the kind of person who doesn't want people to spend too much money on me, so I suggested a smaller Mexican food place that I had been to once or twice. We got there, and they weren't super busy. In fact, it was the middle of the day on a Tuesday, so the restaurant was pretty much empty, with only a few tables being occupied. We got seated, and we sat there for a while before someone came over and asked us if we had been served yet. The person looked like a manager based on how they were dressed, and we mentioned to him that no one had come over to take our order or anything like that, and said that he would take our drink orders right then. He also said that someone else would be right with us to take care of us right away. We told him what we wanted to drink, and he walked away toward the back of the restaurant. After about 3 or so more minutes, a second man walked out from the back with 2 glasses of tea and slammed them down on the table in front of us. He literally slammed them down onto the table, to the point that mine spilled over and made a small mess on the table. I jumped and made a bit of a shocked sound, like, "Oh," and he just stared at me for a moment and then walked away back to the back of the restaurant. I sat there for a few moments, kind of like, what the hell is his problem? But I shrugged it off and cleaned up the mess with my napkin. We just sat there drinking our tea for a few more minutes, talking about nothing in particular. We got through our drinks and then just kind of sat there confused for around 20 more minutes. At this point, I actually apologized to Sasha for recommending this place, as the service was obviously terrible today. She asked me if I had ever had any of these issues here, and I told her no, that both times I had been here, it was a great place. By the time we hit a half hour since we had gotten our tea, I decided to wave down another person that worked there, and I asked them for the manager. They said they would get him and walked to the back. While we were there waiting for him, Sasha said that if I wanted, we could still go to the Italian place, and I said that that sounded like a good idea. When the manager got to our table, he asked if we were still having issues, and I mentioned that, by that point, we'd been sitting there for over 40 minutes, and I would appreciate it if we could just get the check for the drinks and go. The manager apologized to us several times. He said there would be no charge for the teas, and then asked if he could make it up to us with a gift card or something, because this was obviously not the type of service he wanted us to have. I said that was fine, and he went through with getting me the gift card, and then told us to have a nice day. He then immediately walked back to the back, and his face looked angry as hell, to be honest. Like, he walked to the back with a purpose. We went to leave, and within a few moments of us getting out the front door, I heard the door to the restaurant slam open loudly, and somebody shouting. I turned to look at what was going on, and I saw the man that had dropped our drinks on the table walking toward us aggressively and flinging his arms as he screamed at us. To put it PG lightly, he was shouting, "You stupid bees got me fired. What the F is wrong with you, you stupid stuck-up..." Yeah. I was pretty pissed off already about this whole thing, so I just turned around and said that it was his fault that he decided to not do his job. As soon as I said this, the man pulled a kitchen knife from out of his apron and started sprinting at us. I told Sasha to run, and we made a mad dash to the car and jumped in, and shut and locked the doors immediately. After a few seconds, he got to the car and was slamming his hand on my window, screaming that he was going to kill us for ruining his life. I'm sitting there watching this guy slam his fist against the glass and screaming while holding this large knife in his other hand. After banging on the window and trying to pull the door open, he started looking down and reaching towards the tire with the knife, and I told Sasha to gun it. His safety be damned. she did. She threw it in reverse and slammed on the pedal, knocking this guy to the ground, and then drove out of the parking lot as quickly as she could. After getting a few blocks away, she pulled over and asked me what we should do. If we should call the cops, go back, talk to the manager, go make sure that she didn't kill the guy with her car or something. I told her to call the cops and tell them what happened, and I said that I would call the restaurant to see if they needed us to come make a statement. She called 911, and I called the restaurant and talked with the manager. He said that he had already called the cops and that they were actually getting there now. He asked if we were okay, and I told him that, other than being scared out of our minds, we were fine. Sasha then looked over at me and told me that the police wanted us to come back so we could give them a statement. So we turned around and headed back to the restaurant. When we pulled up, the guy was already in handcuffs, and the manager met us alongside the police. We talked to the cops about what happened, and the manager corroborated the whole thing, telling the officers that he had fired the waiter because of the service, and that he then ran out of the kitchen with a knife and said he was going to make us regret it. From what I can tell, it seems like he was just in a bad mood and snapped. Though, I don't know if that really justifies the situation. I've had bad days and I didn't want to deal with people, but I've never grabbed a knife and decided to chase them saying I was going to kill them. Thankfully, nothing more happened, and he was hauled off by the cops. I never went back to that restaurant, and I think I actually still have that gift card in my wallet, though I don't think it'll ever get spent. I used to work at an old restaurant way back in the 90s that was definitely in a really old building, though it was pretty well kept up. That said, I will 100% say that the building was incredibly haunted by a spirit of some sort. Closing was always the worst, because we would always clean and clear out the front of the store first, and then we would be finishing up in the back. When the front was clean and good to go, we would shut off the lights and lock the doors, and all move to the back to clean up the kitchen and the back room. There were an uncountable number of times that people would ask if we had finished out the front, because the lights would kick back on. We would all be in the back, someone would go to the midsection of the restaurant and the lights would be turned back on, and no one would know how. On top of that, we would frequently hear voices coming from the dining room. I heard people talking all the time, but the creepiest time was when we were all in the back and wrapping up, and I heard someone in the front yell, "Where the F is everyone?" At first I freaked out, thinking that we had left the front door unlocked, and maybe someone had made their way into the building thinking we were still open, despite the lights being off. I walked out to the front to tell the gentleman that we were closed and to apologize that we couldn't serve him, but there was no one there. I walked out from behind the counter and looked into the dining room, I checked the restrooms, and then I went and checked the door. It was completely locked. I asked the manager to check the cameras and see if there was someone in the building because we had heard a person shouting, but there was no one on the camera at all until I walked out from the back. This was pretty common. We would hear people talking, check the front, but there was never anything on the cameras, and there was never anyone in the building. One night, I was the closing manager, and I had to spend a lot of my night in the back, keeping numbers looking good and helping prep for the next day as well. I was finishing up counting and filling out the nightly paperwork, and everyone was finishing up the front end cleaning, when I heard a really loud thud and the sound of water splashing. I sighed, thinking that someone had spilled something or whatever while cleaning up the front end, and when I walked out to the front, I noticed that the two people that were cleaning were standing there and staring at the mop bucket tipped on its side, and the mop was halfway across the dining room. I asked them what had happened, and one of them mentioned that the mop and the bucket literally just flung themselves. I asked what they meant, and they explained that they had stopped mopping for a moment to do something behind the bar, and as soon as they did, the mop bucket was flung onto its side, and the mop was practically thrown across the room. I brought them both to the back, and we went to check the camera, and sure enough, the mop bucket and mop fell on their own. It wasn't like they had just tipped over and fell, it was like someone had put their foot on it and kicked it as hard as possible to knock it over. But there was no one there. It was seriously crazy, but I basically told him that we just have to move on and mop up the water. One of the other things that I recall happening was actually an apparition. There was one night where we had closed and were finishing the nightly books and all that. When I looked up at the camera, I saw what looked like a person standing by the doorway and staring out the window. She looked like she was dressed in clothes from the early 1900s, like the 1920s or 30s. She just kind of stood there and stared out, and then slowly turned to look up at the camera and basically faded away. It was the creepiest thing, and even though it was only a few seconds of footage, the entire time I watched her, I felt my veins running cold. Of course, I was the only one that saw it, and I only saw her the one time, but it was probably the freakiest thing to happen there. So, those were 3 of the strangest events I remember about our restaurant. We had a few other small events that happened here and there, but really these were the ones that were worth mentioning. I don't work there anymore, but I still go up to have dinner there and to talk to the owner, and they've mentioned that they've seen similar apparitions in the cameras randomly. Honestly, it really is crazy to me how a restaurant that is so busy all the time could get so creepy at night. Nothing ever happened while the restaurant was full, or during the day. The ghosts always waited until after we closed to become active. Either way, it was a creepy place to be after dark, and I'm actually kind of glad that I don't work there anymore. When I was a teenager, I used to work at a locally owned sandwich shop that was pretty well known by the local people, but is now dead and gone thanks to the owner basically just abandoning it. I actually worked there when they decided to give up on the shop, and this was a nightmare in and of itself, but the event that I wanted to submit doesn't have anything to do with that. The story that I wanted to send to you is actually one that took place about 1.5 years after I started working there. The sandwich shop that I worked at was small, and there weren't a lot of employees. I think that there was just the 4 of us and the 2 managers. The shop had a bad habit of following behind other, larger sandwich chains. When Subway started doing salads, they decided that we needed to do salads too. When other sandwich chains started doing toasted sandwiches, they bought a small conveyor oven for us to use to toast sandwiches if the customers wanted it. They actually spent a lot of money redoing the menu and options, and buying new hardware for the store every single time there was a new thing that the other places were doing. It was honestly the most annoying thing that I've ever dealt with in a job. Anyways, there was one night that I was working the line with another person, and it was just the 2 of us until closing time when the general manager would be coming in to count down the register. The 2 of us that were working there were both pretty young. I was a 17-year-old guy and my coworker was a 19-year-old girl, so we weren't exactly the most threatening employees there. While we were working, making the food for the customers and cleaning up where we could, I noticed that there was a guy that was pacing around in the parking lot and looking at people's cars. I mentioned this to my coworker, but she basically said that he hadn't really done anything illegal, so we should just ignore him and he would probably go away. I shrugged and just kept on sweeping, assuming that she was right, and that I should just do what she told me since she was my senior. About 10 minutes or so later, I looked up from sweeping and noticed that the man was now staring into the restaurant with his hands cupped around his eyes and his face against the glass. I kind of just waved at him like, hi, and went back to sweeping. Then, I heard the doorbell going off and noticed that he had walked into the store. I hadn't paid a whole lot of attention to him until this point, and I noticed that he was pretty messy. I don't mean like he was just dirty. I mean he looked literally messy. His hair was tangled and all over the place. His beard looked like it had something in it. His face was dark with dirt or something. He just looked messy. My assumption was that he may have been homeless, and I wasn't really sure what to expect. But I leaned the broom over and hopped back behind the counter, and then asked him how I could help him. He just kind of stared at me with the look like he was crazy. Bulging eyes, nose flared, mouth in a frown, just seriously crazy. After a few moments, I asked him if he was okay and if I could help him with something, and he responds with, "What do you have?" I start going over the menu, telling him the option for the meats, the bread, the cheese, basically just throwing all the information that I could at him about the menu. He just stares at me as I'm listing all the options, and then he tells me to stop talking because I was being too loud. I stopped and just kind of looked around like, okay. After a few moments, he leans in and asks me if I'm alone. For some dumb reason, I responded with, "No, my manager's in the back. Would you like me to get her?" And he just kind of laughed. And then he started walking towards the door. Or at least I thought he was walking towards the door. He stepped toward the exit and kind of glanced in both directions, and then turned back towards me. He pulled out this big-ass hunting knife from his pocket and started back behind the counter. He then starts shouting at me, but I couldn't tell you what the hell he was saying. He wasn't screaming about wanting money. He wasn't telling me to do anything. He was just incoherently screaming as loud as he could while waving the knife in my direction. I put my hands up and told him that he could have whatever it was that he wanted, that I was not going to stop him. I stood back against the wall and just motioned for the station, and then looked back and saw my manager standing in the back watching this play out. I didn't expect her to do anything more, honestly. She was smaller than I was, even though she was 2 years older, and I wasn't expecting her to risk her life. To my surprise, this guy literally starts making a sandwich after screeching at me. He grabs the bread from the cabinet and rips it open, then he starts piling as much into it as he could. He then shoves it on the metal plate and then shoves that into the toaster, and he walks around to the other side and just stares at it as it's going through. When I say he was staring, he was fixated on this sandwich as it was going through the oven. It took around 2 or 3 minutes to get through, and his face was up to the exit just watching it go. This whole time, the two of us are just standing there staring at him make his own food. I think we were both trying to figure out what the hell was going on in this situation. After a few minutes of him watching it toast, he literally reaches his hand into the oven and grabs his sandwich. What was terrifying about that, he didn't even flinch. That thing was something like 200 degrees Fahrenheit, so there's no way he did not burn his hand. He literally grabbed his sandwich, pulled it from the oven, and started shoving it into his mouth right then and there. He was eating this scorching hot sandwich, and then he just turned and left. Obviously, we called the cops to report the event, and we had to give them the security footage, and then we called the manager and owner to come up so we could close the store. Honestly, it was weird as hell, and I have no idea why this guy went about things this way. If he had told me that he didn't have the money to buy anything, I would have probably just made him a sandwich for free. But he decided that he wanted to go about it the crazy way. I don't know if the cops ever caught the guy or if he got away, but I never saw him again. While it was a scary situation, part of me does hope that he didn't burn his hands or mouth too bad with that sandwich. Mostly because I know that that must have hurt. This was honestly the most messed up situation that we ever dealt with, though not the only creepy one. Thankfully, no one was hurt, because I know that had he not just been hungry, this all could have gone much, much worse. I have a short but kind of creepy story that happened to me a while back when I worked as a waitress at a bar and grill. It's probably not the scariest thing, but it was definitely creepy to me, and I'm glad that it ended how it did. So, like I mentioned, I was a waitress for a restaurant that most people are aware of and have probably been to. I don't know if I should say the name of it, so I won't say it by the name. I've worked there for several years at this point, and I even worked through COVID, so I've seen my share of weird stuff. But this specific situation was one that genuinely freaked me out. This happened around the time when restaurants started opening back up after the pandemic, so business was pretty slow, with the exception of to-go orders. I'd been assigned a few tables and was one of the 2 people that were working as waitstaff that day. Most of the day I was just cleaning up the store and helping out the to-go section. I was in the middle of bagging an order when the greeter came over to me and mentioned that I had a seat that I needed to take care of. I thanked her and walked over to the table only to be surprised by who it was. It was actually one of my high school math teachers. I happily said hi to him and asked him how he was, and he seemed to be just as happy and excited to see me. I thought it was kind of neat seeing a teacher after having been out of high school for like 7 years, so I was getting pretty friendly with my conversation with him, telling him how I've been doing, how I've managed for the past few years, and all that. He then asked me if I was still with James, who was my boyfriend through the entirety of high school. I told him that I wasn't, that he had moved away from the state for school, and that we just decided to go our separate directions. He frowned and said, "Aw, that's sad, but it's good to know you're doing okay. Are you single, or are you seeing anyone?" Which, to me, was a bit odd, but at the same time, he had just asked about my ex, so it also made sense as to why he would ask. I told him that I was single at the moment, and just enjoying my time to myself. He laughed and followed that up with, "You'll find someone. You know, I always thought you were pretty attractive while you were in my class. I'm surprised that you didn't have the guys all over you, to be honest." Which was not something I expected to hear from him, especially considering the fact that, while I was in his class, I was a minor. I just kind of smiled and said thanks, thinking maybe I misinterpreted what he meant, and then shifted the attention to asking what I could get for him. He asked for a glass of water and then mentioned that he was going to need a bit to decide what he wanted. I said okay, and then went off to get him his water. I put it on the table and then told him that I would be right back in a few moments to get his order, or to answer any questions. As I walked away from the table, I realized that I needed to use the restroom really quick. I went in and got in the stall to do my business. While I was there, I heard someone else walk into the restroom and walk past my stall and into the stall on the end. I then finished what I was doing, and I went to wash my hands, and as soon as I exited the stall, I heard the door open. It was my general manager. She stood in the doorway and told me that she needed to see me in her office for a moment. I told her that I would be right there as soon as I washed my hands, and she told me that I could just wash my hands in the back, and that it was urgent that I came with her right then. Obviously, I was a bit taken aback, honestly thinking I was about to get fired, so I told her okay and just immediately went right with her. As soon as we got back to the kitchen area, the manager asked me if I hadn't noticed what was going on. I told her that I didn't know what she was talking about, and then I asked if I did something wrong. She then tells me that a few moments after I walked into the restroom, she watched the customer that I had been chatting with walk back and go straight into the women's restroom. She said that she was a bit concerned, so she wanted to check on me, and then when she opened the door, she saw his feet under the back stall door, like he was just standing there at the door of the stall and waiting, which is why she was telling me to just come with her. Obviously, I was a bit freaked out. What the hell was he doing following me into the restroom? And worse, what were his intentions? After talking through it, she said that she would go ask him to leave so that I didn't have to, and we both went to where the back met the front, and sure enough, he was already gone. She went to check the restroom and he wasn't there either. We both assumed that he realized he was caught and then left out the side door in a panic. This whole situation really scared me. His statement was a bit creepy, but I would have never expected him to follow me into the restroom, nor would I have ever expected him to be such a creep. I'm beyond thankful that my manager was paying attention and saw him follow me, because had she not, I can only imagine what he could, or would, have done to me. Alright, so that was a collection of restaurant horror stories that take place in a restaurant where normally you would just go to get your Pollo Magnifico if you go to Jose Pepper's down the street from me. Yeah. But these people who went there, or I guess worked there, got a lot more than they bargained for. Hopefully it didn't add gratuity to the check. I'm trying to make a pun or a joke or something to relate the stories to a restaurant, and let me tell you, it is not working. My brain is not able to make a good quip in this situation for some reason. So, how about this? I'm heading to Starbucks. Does anyone want anything? If you enjoyed the video, please do consider hitting that thumbs up button, and if you are new to the channel, please consider subscribing if you liked what you heard. Ugh, brain fart. And, if you would like, you can leave me a comment. Let me know what you're getting from Starbucks. I'll also stop at another coffee house if you'd like along the way, or maybe McDonald's if you're hungry. Your choice. I don't have to just go to Starbucks. It was just a thought at the time. I could go for a cold brew, Yeah. And you can also hit the thanks button down below, or join or Patreon, where you can, get early access, support the channel further. Never ever expected, always appreciated. Though if I am going to McDonald's, I will have to have you at least pay half of your bill. Toll? Toll. Good choice, Raven. Toll. Good word to use there. Does not fit in this context in any way, shape, or form. I hope you all have a beautiful day. I hope that you're doing well. And I hope to see you on the next video. But of course, my friends, until then, sleep well.